Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Thursday's members podcast. I'm Chloe Tetro, the health coach here with Ready Care. And for this morning, we're going to be looking at boundaries. We're going to be looking at what they are, the different types of boundaries that are there, setting healthy boundaries, and how that can help yourself and others and your relationships in your life. So, to begin with, let's have a quick look at what it is that is meant by the term boundaries. It's something that we've all kind of heard throughout our lives, but what exactly is a boundary? It's an essential part of our lives, because if we think about it, our life is made up by things we agree to do, set our time and energy into, and our experiences are created from our decisions to say yes or no to specific things. So when we think about a boundary, it really is the portal of what we say yes to and no to. So what it would be is it's kind of this invisible line. It's an invisible line of what we choose to let into our lives and what we choose to put out into our lives. There would be physical, emotional, mental limits that we establish for ourselves in our interactions with others. They are unique to each individual and can vary on your personal values, belief systems, experiences. What might be okay for you might not be okay for somebody else. So it's about knowing and effectively communicating your personal boundaries. It's very crucial to establishing and maintaining healthy relationships. And it allows us to protect our emotional and physical safety or psychological safety. It sets expectations and maintains a sense of self respect and dignity within ourselves. Now, on the flip side, the absence of clear boundaries can result in feelings of anxiety, of stress, and of resentment. And resentment's a big one that can come up, and it can creep in a way that kind of blindsides us and oftentimes blindsides the other party in the dialogue. So effective boundary setting, which we'll have a look at today, it involves asserting your own boundaries, so knowing what they are, step one, respecting those of others, which is absolutely crucial. And it's really gaining a sense of how important these are. And when somebody else communicates them, to really recognize that that is something that's been communicated and to create a dialogue around it. There's a degree of active listening, a willingness to compromise when necessary, and when they're respected, the relationships will thrive, and individuals can feel more valued and respected. So let's have a quick look at the types of boundaries. There are different types of boundaries out there. So physical landscape boundaries do not cross. But there's physical, emotional, time, intimate boundaries. The physical boundaries would refer to your personal space. So the space and touch we feel comfortable with from others, and we can communicate that through our body language and verbal communication. That's your kind of more immediate boundary. You know, if somebody's too close to you, I think sometimes the natural inclination for most people is to take a little bit of a step back because something's been entered that you're not totally comfortable with. The emotional boundaries then are about how we feel and express emotions with others, how we communicate them through our words, actions, and body language. That would be one that really is kind of, that's the kicker. That's the one that a lot of people would really feel the most difficulty with. And it's something that we'll get into a little bit more throughout our time together today. Time boundaries and energy boundaries, I would put those two together. They refer to setting limits on our time and availability for others. And this is very closely enmeshed with the emotional aspect of the boundaries. And then the intimacy aspect of it is how much we are comfortable with receiving a degree of intimacy. And that can range from sexual touch to even just the degree of personal information that we're comfortable sharing with others. When our personal boundaries are violated, it can have a significant psychological impact. So it's very important to really give it the weight that it deserves. It can bring on discomfort, anger, anxiety, and shame if somebody else crosses our boundaries. On the other hand, setting and maintaining healthy boundaries can improve our mental health, our self-esteem, our overall sense of well-being, and it can help to prevent codependency that is an over enmeshment with another person. And some of you there might have that in, your repertoire of experiences to have. It could be a friend, it could be a partner. But when boundaries are quite poor, or a family member actually, or a work colleague, or anybody really, when there is a disintegration of boundaries, sometimes what can happen is an enmeshment with another person where it can feel like they're stepping into our personal space so much that that boundary between what is ourselves and what is the other can become a little bit blurred, primarily psychologically, but in lots of different ways. So let's have a look at some of the signs that there could be difficulty with boundaries. And have a check on these and see, do any of these resonate with you? I know for myself, when I was looking this up, I had to cringe and go, yeah, I can recognize definitely in my younger self, but it's good to have awareness of whether this is something that is showing up in your life. So people who struggle with asserting boundaries may experience a range of symptoms. I say symptoms, but symptoms, telltale signs, let's say. It's less clinical. And specific emotions that can signal a difficulty in setting and maintaining personal limits. So we think of that invisible wall, self and other. Some signs can be feeling overwhelmed. And I think that's one of the biggest ones, really, that there's been a disintegration in our ability to communicate when we have had enough, when we're taking on too much, when we're saying yes, when we should be saying no. And that includes with ourselves. When we're pushing and pushing and not able to connect in with that inner compass that says, I can't do this right now. So feeling overwhelmed is one. Feeling resentful. And what I mean by resentful is sometimes there is a tendency to agree to something, whether that's motivated by a desire to please, a desire to be liked, a desire to not want to seem like you can't do something. So when that tendency to agree to things beyond your personal boundaries, when that kind of contract is made with the other person and you have not asserted your boundary, because remember, it's up to you to assert your own personal boundaries. I love the saying, I love the saying and immediately forgets it. Givers have to set boundaries because takers never do. And I think that feeling of resent, and I think it shows up in family dynamics quite a bit, where somebody is a big giver and they give and they give and they give and they give, and all of a sudden they go, God, nobody ever helps me, or I do all of these things for these other people, and why is it that nobody ever looks after me? What's happened there is actually that you've overgiven to the point that you're no longer comfortable with what you're putting out there, what you're giving to others. And there has been a lack of communication of that boundary, which is leading to resent, which can unfortunately lead to feelings of being taken advantage of in relationships, work situations, or social situations. So people that have that difficulty would obviously have some amount of difficulty with saying no, and they feel guilty when they do. In extreme cases, people may experience symptoms of anxiety, depression, other mental health issues as a result of lack of clear communications about boundaries. Another common indicator of difficulty with boundaries is a pattern of people pleasing and putting other people's needs first. And this is a tricky one because there's almost a badge of honor that goes, it happens more with women, but it's not always women. There's a kind of, there's a leniency there with women towards that kind of people pleasing aspect, putting others' needs first. And it's worn as this type of value, that it's something they value in themselves, that they do put other people's needs first. But that can pendulum swing into something that's quite unhealthy, actually. And because of the lens that it's been viewed through as, oh, well, this is a good thing. I am a good person if I put other people's needs ahead of my own. It's very difficult to break that down or to peel that back, to actually take a step back and go, gosh, I'm in way over my head. I'm totally overwhelmed. I feel rubbish because I feel like I'm giving, and not getting anything back. So it's a very, very tricky one when that feeling has been tied to something that's quote unquote valued. Um, so there can be a leniency towards feeling that they have to be available all the time. And I think if you're listening there, so most people check some of these points. That constant availability, even if it means sacrificing their own time and their own energy. They might struggle with setting and achieving personal goals because they might be more focused on meeting the needs of others. And that's something that kind of slaps a lot of people in the face and can have a desperate impact on your self-esteem and your self-worth. Because if you're constantly utilizing your finite resource of time and energy to constantly meet the needs of others, you are going to be too exhausted when it comes to you having a little bit of precious free time to actually focus on your own goals. And when you have an expanded amount of time where that's the recurring loop, it's the recurring pattern that you come last, and that your goals don't matter as much as everybody else's, that starts to get ingrained quite negatively into our psyche and ourselves with regards of how it is that we feel about who we are in the world. There can be a tendency as well with people who struggle with boundary setting in seeking validation and approval from others rather than relying on their own internal sense of self-worth. And that can lead to this constant seeking of external validation, feeling inadequate, unfulfilled, and seeking more validation to fill that kind of emptiness where you've given that power away to another person. Overall, it can have, as I'm sounding it out, it can have significant impact on individual mental and emotional well-being. It can actually lead to chronic stress, burnout, low self-esteem, as well as a sense of powerlessness. So the kind of tricky thing with this as well is that expressing your needs can result initially in feelings of guilt or shame for prioritizing and having that assertion. And it can stem from a variety of factors. I mean, upbringing, cultural factors, societal norms, the way you were brought up, what you experienced in your lives. Um, but what the thread coming out of that is that individuals like that can gain a specific, I say individuals like that, when I put up my hand with it a little bit as well. I think, most people can resonate up to a point with it. So there can be a degree of negative self-talk and belief systems around themselves, such as I'm not important enough to have boundaries, or if I set boundaries, people won't like me. Um, and over time, that can shape an individual's view of themselves and the world around them, and they can start to really believe that their needs are not valid and they're not deserving of respect or consideration. Um, but it is not all doom and gloom. Don't worry, I'm kind of like going really deep into that just so I can really show like what it is that the picture, the full picture of that and how important these things are. The other thing actually is difficulty asserting personal boundaries can impact relationships with others in several ways. So, for example, if someone is unable to communicate their boundaries clearly, their friends, family, or colleagues might inadvertently cross this boundary. And that can lead to massive frustration and resentment on both sides, and can lead, to conflict and communication breakdown and relationship breakdown. Essentially, when we are agreeing to something that is not authentic or truthful to ourselves, there is an agreement or a pact made on terms that are not realistic, where both parties have not had the full rounded information. Because let's think of this particular scenario with the work colleague. The work colleague fully believes that you are totally okay with it. And if you are stressed, burnt out, and start to avoid them, that can be very confusing for them and could potentially lead to frustrations, because they'll go, well, you said that was no problem. No problem. I'll get right on it. No problem. So what is it that has changed So the benefits then, which will be, fairly self-explanatory, is just everything I've said, but the opposite. So the healthy boundaries are essential for maintaining positive relationships and promoting your personal well-being. And I think it's all good and grand to think of the impact on others and our interpersonal relationships, but really a lot of this comes back down to how you view yourself. If you think back a while ago about the impact on the self-esteem, the impact of feeling that your own needs are not important, your own life goals are not important, that's that's a fairly sizable blow to a person's sense of self, and it's not necessary. It's something that can be worked on, so it will vastly improve your personal well-being to start to develop ways to actually go about asserting healthy boundaries. It can be better. It can blah, 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 word blah, blah, blah. It's a better way to be able to communicate your needs, your feelings, and expectations clearly to another person. So both parties know, and you know exactly where you're at with things. It promotes mutual respect and understanding between individuals, and it can lead to the increase in your self esteem and confidence. By respecting and valuing your own needs and boundaries, you can develop a greater sense of self worth and become more assertive in other areas of your life, which can lead to greater personal growth and success. Um, when you have clear boundaries in place, you can better manage stress. So remember, your overwhelm is going to go down. Your interpersonal relationships are a little bit healthier, so you don't have to avoid people as you pass them in the corridors, and you don't have that pressure of, oh God, I have to get back onto that person about this, that, and the other thing. Um, Now, in saying that, it's not all rosy. When trying to assert specific boundaries, there are some challenges that can come up, which I mentioned a while ago. So that experience of guilt or shame, and these feelings can arise when someone's attempts to assert their needs and preferences, especially if they're not used to doing so, are met with, maybe not the best responses. And to be honest with you, if it's your first few times doing it, especially if it's quite new to you, specific people in your life that are very used to being, how do I put it diplomatically, liberal with their meeting of your boundaries, can find it a little bit like, oh, that's not usually how you react. So it's important to recognize that feeling guilty and ashamed for setting and enforcing boundaries is a common experience. It's not just you, don't worry. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the boundary is inappropriate or unnecessary. Another challenge that people might encounter is pushback. Because people aren't used to you behaving in a certain way. And there's a great saying, actually, my mom says it to me all the time, but I'd say it's probably, I don't know, it's basically you teach people how to treat you, and there's a learning curve sometimes. So if people have been used to treating you a certain way because you have inadvertently allowed them to do that, there's a bit of a learning curve, and there's a little bit of a pushback that can happen. They might resist or even disregard personal boundaries altogether because they don't understand the importance of the boundary, or they might feel threatened by it. In these cases, it is helpful to calmly and assertively communicate the importance of the boundary and how it supports the relationship. The fear of conflict, that's another massive one, is another challenge that people can face when it comes to boundary setting. It can initially be challenging to assert boundaries when there is a risk of conflict, especially if the person is conflict adverse. So they have a bit of difficulty, it makes them a bit uncomfortable, or has had negative experiences with conflict in the past. In these situations, it is helpful to approach the conversation in a non-confrontational way, as best you can. And a really good tip I can give for this is to use I statements instead of you statements. And what I mean by that is, if you are approaching somebody and you have a little bit of an adverse reaction to conflict, instead of saying, you make me feel very small when you speak to me that way, that can come across exceedingly confrontational for somebody on the receiving end, who will get their defenses up very, very quickly, and very quickly the conversation can actually turn into a conflict. A very simple way to switch that around is to use I instead of you, because what you are doing is you're not judging or chastising somebody else for their behavior, even though you might feel like that on the inside. Let's be honest. What you're doing is you're taking full responsibility and ownership of how you feel in a given moment, and you are communicating it, which is as much as you can do with a boundary. You're speaking truthfully from an authentic space by saying things like, I feel quite small due to some of our interactions, or I can feel quite belittled. And if somebody chooses to react how they do, that is entirely up to them. But in that moment, you've said how you feel, or I would prefer if we were more polite to each other in our interactions, as opposed to, you are quite rude to me quite often. See, it kind of changes the tone and the dynamic of a conversation. It is important to look at these with a degree of empathy and self-compassion. It's not always easy, and it doesn't matter how practiced you are with boundary setting. It is never totally easy, but it does get easier. It will very much positively impact as you go along. So stick with it and give yourself plenty of practice with small ways. So I will give you a few little prompts, because you might say, Chloe, that is all fine and good, but what do I actually do? What do I actually do when it comes to any of this? So I would say start small, especially if you're somebody that knows that they've resonated with everything said, and they know for a fact they have some difficulty. So start small, and maybe give yourself parameters where it's a very safe interaction with somebody that's not going to go off the rocker. And you can even let somebody very close to you know that you are trying to get better at this. So start with self-awareness. To establish healthy boundaries, you have to understand and identify your own boundaries. And that's a big moot point sometimes, because sometimes we're not even sure what they are. So it can be helpful to ask yourself specific questions, like, what feels comfortable, what feels uncomfortable about this specific interaction with that specific person, or what situations do I feel anxious or stressed in. Once you have identified the boundaries, it's very essential to actually communicate them, because oftentimes there can be that resentment piece can come back into it, because we might think we were exceedingly clear because we were afraid of conflict. We kind of breadcrumbed an assertion of boundaries, but really you want to make sure that there's absolute clarity, because otherwise you are expecting the other person to do an awful lot of the work to understand your boundary, when really it shouldn't be work. It shouldn't be a guessing game. It shouldn't be mind reading. So very assertively and clearly, and that can be done in a very kind and positive manner, saying things like, I actually do feel a bit uncomfortable when this comes up, or I actually need more time and energy to myself in these particular ways, or to preserve my own time and energy, it's actually okay for me to fill in the blanks, type of thing. And being able to give that back to others. So respecting other people's boundaries, recognizing and respecting, it's just as important as setting our own. And it can be helpful to ask for clarification if you're unsure of somebody else's boundaries around something. Respect their wishes, even if they differ from our own. Big one, consistency. Maintain the personal boundaries over time. It's going to be one of the healthiest ways and quickest ways to actually show that you mean it, which can be challenging, but really saying, oh, this isn't okay today, and tomorrow you've gone, oh, actually it is okay. That's going to be quite messy for yourself and another person in regards to understanding. So as a practical exercise, that self-reflection piece, boundary setting exercises with a friend or family member in low-stakes situations, Practice saying no in small ways. Remember that the things you say yes to make up the time and energy of your life. It's time and energy you will not get back. So really understanding how sacred that time and energy is, and being very consistent. Now, as a little closing, if you want to, I can I'm just going to give a few prompts, especially for people who definitely struggle with this. So I'll give a few questions. I think it's about 8 of them. If you want to pause it on the look back, jot them down for yourself, or just even have a quick think about them today and throughout your day. So a few prompt questions for you for setting healthy boundaries. What are some situations in which I feel my boundaries are being violated? Take some time with that and jot down a few of them if you can. What are some specific behaviors that make me uncomfortable and make me feel disrespected? And really gaining an awareness around that. What are some specific behaviors that I engage in that may be violating somebody else's boundary? And those are always way more difficult. Like we're definitely like a first person video game. Everything's always a lot easier for us to view through our own lens, but getting that detachment and self-awareness around how is it that maybe I could be doing something that crosses somebody else's boundary. That's a really, really important self-awareness piece. How do I typically respond when somebody violates my boundaries? Am I of the ilk that will blow the lid totally, which is not, by the way, a healthy boundary? Am I somebody that goes, that's okay, don't worry about it? Oh no, you're fine, you're totally fine. There's no problem. How can I communicate my boundaries more clearly and assertively in different situations? Whether it be family, friends, workplaces, is there a different register for each of those places that I need to adopt to be able to assert and communicate positively? How can I maintain consistency in enforcing my boundaries over time? Consistency is great, as I mentioned, for others, but it's also really good for yourself because you're going to rewrite that scenario of my needs aren't important, my goals aren't important. And each time that you solidify and practice that boundary, you're reaffirming to yourself all of your neuron network, all of your brain, all of your psyche, that you're important, your needs are important, your goals are important. And that over time will compound to really, really changing how you view yourself, the world, and others. And how can I practice self-care in prioritizing my own needs while respecting the needs of others? Oftentimes, self-care is thought of as sleep, food, diet, exercise, which is absolutely, you know, they're all fantastic. But self-care can come from really looking after our own psychological needs, our emotions, and our boundaries. So, what ways can I really give myself the time to do to take that time, take that energy for myself and respect it? And finally, what are some potential challenges or obstacles that I could face in establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries? And I always think it's good to get ahead of those things and see are there specific ways that I can anticipate a difficulty and address it straight on. So that's kind of the little introduction to boundaries for today, setting healthy boundaries and understanding what it can look like when our boundaries are a little bit wobbly, how that may negatively impact ourselves and others, and what we can do to really get the best out of our health and well-being and our interpersonal our relationships. If you have any little questions or comments that you'd like to jot down, I'll give a few seconds there. Otherwise, enjoy your day, enjoy your week, and have some fun practicing saying no to people more often. You can tell them I said that. Have a lovely day, and we will be chatting to you next week. Bye now.